Beneath the twin suns of a distant empire, the palace of the alien court rose like a cathedral of crystal and fire. Towers stretched so high they pierced the clouds, each one alive with rivers of light, as though the stars themselves had been captured and chained into glass. The air trembled with solemn hymns sung by machines older than memory, while vast banners unfurled from the battlements, their colors shifting like liquid flame. It was a place built not merely to govern, but to remind every soul who entered of their smallness. Inside the grand hall, marble floors gleamed as if they had never known the stain of a footprint. Colossal pillars, etched with constellations, reached endlessly upward, holding a ceiling that mirrored the night sky, studded with galaxies. Rows of noble beings stood in silence, their eyes sharp, their garments woven from threads of impossible metals. The Empire's might was on display, radiant, unyielding, eternal. And yet, hidden among the spectacle, there was one who did not belong. A man, human, mortal. He stood at the edge of the gathering, a plain figure in worn clothes, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of a life that had given little and taken much. At his side, a small girl clung to his hand, her eyes wide with a child's wonder, though she too was unseen. They were ghosts within this kingdom of light. To the nobles, they were less than nothing, background shadows, tolerated but unnoticed. The man did not speak. He did not move. He breathed quietly, as though afraid the sound alone might draw contempt. Around him, voices rose in laughter, the cruel kind born from power and certainty. If they saw him at all, it was only to dismiss him, to mark him as the dust that settled at their feet. But destiny does not always rise in golden robes. Sometimes it hides itself in rags. Sometimes the power that will shatter empires waits patiently in silence, ignored until the moment it can no longer be denied. Here, in this hall of glittering arrogance, a story was about to begin. A story no one expected. A story no one wanted to believe. And yet, history itself would remember. For this man, this weary father, forgotten and invisible, would soon stand at the center of a storm that would tear through the foundations of the empire. The alien princess had not yet entered. The nobles had not yet fallen into silence. The world still believed itself unshakable. But soon, one gesture, one impossible recognition, would bring everything crashing down. And so, before we continue, pause for a moment. Subscribe now, so you never miss the stories that reveal how the smallest lives can carry the greatest legacies. Because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The court of the alien empire was not merely a throne room. It was a universe contained within walls. Every corner glittered with wealth beyond imagination. Sculptures carved from starlight itself, fountains spilling with liquid silver, and soldiers standing in rows so precise they might have been carved from stone. Their armor shimmered, their faces stern, their eyes trained only on power. Here, hierarchy was not a rule. It was a religion. Above all stood the nobles of the high races, creatures sculpted in symmetry and grace, their bloodlines stretching back to the empire's dawn. They floated upon thrones suspended in air, each one adorned with crowns that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Their voices, when they spoke, rang with a melody sharp as crystal. To them, every word was a decree, every glance a judgment. And at the bottom of this grand ladder, far beneath the gilded seats and radiant crowns, were the humans. Not enemies, not equals, not even servants of respect. They were tolerated only because someone had to sweep the floors, mend the gears, and carry the burdens that the noble races found beneath them. The poor human father was one of these. Day after day, he walked the palace corridors, unseen, unheard, a shadow among stars. He had been assigned no title, given no rank. Even his name, once spoken with love, had become an afterthought in these halls. To the empire, he was human, a single word that meant disposable, forgettable, unworthy. And yet he endured, not for glory, not for himself, but for the small hand that held his own, for the daughter whose eyes searched for beauty even in the cracks of a cruel world. She saw wonder where he saw only survival. When she looked at the gleaming towers, she whispered dreams. When he looked, he counted hours of labor, scars of toil. The nobles mocked without words. A glance was enough, a curl of the lip, a whispered laugh. Sometimes sharper insults slipped through. Why are these shadows allowed to stand so near? Or even their breath seems out of place among us. The father lowered his head each time, for to answer would mean punishment. To resist would mean exile, and exile meant death. But humiliation was not always loud. Sometimes it was silence, the kind that makes a man disappear even while standing in the light. That silence pressed upon him now as the nobles gathered, their silks brushing against his worn sleeves, their jewels blazing against his plain, dust-stained hands. No one looked at him, no one cared. He was a ghost dressed in flesh. And yet, the empire had grown arrogant in its certainty. It had forgotten that shadows can stretch longer than towers, that dust, when stirred, can choke even kings. The father's daughter tugged at his hand, pointing toward the golden dais where the throne of the princess would soon stand. Her whisper carried no fear, only awe. He smiled faintly, though his heart ached. He knew she was dreaming of a world that would never notice her, never honor her, never embrace her. At least that was what he believed. The nobles laughed louder as they spoke of the day's coming ceremony, their voices sharp like blades. The air was heavy with pride, with arrogance polished to a mirror shine. In their minds, the future was certain, the hierarchy eternal. They did not see the way fate coils in silence. They did not sense the tremor building beneath their perfect floor. And so the father stood, unnoticed, humiliated, small. The last man anyone would expect to matter. The last voice anyone would choose to hear. But history, as it has always done, was preparing to turn. For in moments, the doors would open, the hall would fall silent, and the gaze of the princess would break the world they thought unshakable. The hour arrived. From the far end of the crystalline hall, the colossal doors stirred. They were not doors in the human sense, each one a slab of living stone, carved with shifting constellations, their weight so immense that entire legions could not move them. And yet, as the moment came, they opened in silence, as though bowing before something greater than themselves. Light poured in, gold and violet, spilling across the marble floor like a tide of fire. The nobles straightened, every whisper cut short, every smirk vanishing into reverence. Soldiers stamped their spears against the ground in unison, the echo a thunder that rolled through the hall. The air thickened, charged with awe. She entered, the alien princess. Her steps did not touch the ground, for the ground itself seemed unworthy to bear her. A mantle of woven starlight trailed behind her, shifting with the colors of nebulae, and upon her brow rested a diadem carved from the core of a fallen star. Her eyes, twin flames of silver and storm, swept across the gathered court, piercing deeper than sight, as if they read not faces but souls. The nobles bowed low, their voices hushed into silence. Here stood the daughter of empires, the promise of a dynasty unbroken, the living embodiment of power. Even the air seemed to kneel before her. And yet, within that silence, among the thousands of glittering faces, one figure remained unseen. The poor human father. Bent shoulders, worn clothes, dust clinging to his hands. He lowered his head, not out of loyalty, but out of survival. Around him, the crowd pressed in, every jewel blazing brighter than his existence. He held his daughter close, shielding her from the crush, hoping only to remain unnoticed. But fate has a way of turning eyes where no eyes wish to look. The princess's gaze swept the room, over nobles in their crowns, over generals plated in armor, over priests cloaked in robes older than nations, until it stopped. It stopped on him. For a heartbeat, the hall seemed to waver. The soldiers stiffened. The nobles dared not breathe. None could understand why her gaze, sharp as lightning, would falter upon a shadow. Then it happened. Slowly, deliberately, the princess raised her hand. Her jeweled finger extended, steady as destiny itself. And she pointed at the poor human father. A gasp shivered through the hall, rippling like a storm across still water. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as though the universe itself had frozen. To be chosen, even by a glance, was an honor reserved for bloodlines older than stars. To be pointed at was a declaration, a summons that could not be undone. The nobles trembled, the generals frowned, the priests whispered prayers, afraid to believe what they were seeing. And the father, he did not even dare lift his head. His daughter tugged at his sleeve, eyes wide with fear and wonder. He stood as stone, silent, unbelieving. But the princess did not waver. Her hand remained raised, her eyes locked upon him, as if she had found what the court could not see. And in that moment, the empire itself shifted. The question was no longer who he was. The question became why. Why him? Why now? The silence swelled until it could break no further. And from that silence, the storm of trials was about to begin. The hall had not yet breathed again. The princess's hand still lingered, pointing, declaring before the galaxy's finest that she had chosen a man none would have noticed. Whispers slithered like serpents across the chamber, nobles leaning into one another with disbelief etched into their jeweled faces. Generals narrowed their eyes, searching for reason. Priests murmured prayers that sounded like protests. And then came the laugh, low, sharp, poison wrapped in silk. From the front of the hall, a figure stepped forward, the High Minister, keeper of law, guardian of tradition, rival to every spark of change. His robes billowed like storm clouds, embroidered with sigils of authority, his face carved in cold arrogance. He bowed deeply to the princess, though his lips curled with disdain. "Your Highness," he purred, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. "Surely your gaze has faltered. Surely it was not meant for that." The crowd erupted, relieved to hear aloud what they all thought. They nodded, muttered, some laughed cruelly. Heads turned toward the poor father, who stood still as stone, shrinking further into shadow. The princess did not lower her hand. Her eyes remained fixed upon him. The minister's smile sharpened. "Very well," he said, voice dripping venom. "If destiny insists upon parading shadows into the light, let us test whether they can withstand it." He clapped his hands, and attendants wheeled forth an object older than memory. A monolith of black stone, carved with spirals of alien script, pulsing faintly with hidden fire. It was the puzzle of origin, whispered of in legends, believed unsolvable except by those of true bloodlines. For centuries, it had stood untouched, a symbol of mystery. The minister's voice rang out, "Let the man prove himself before the eyes of the court. Let him awaken what no shadow has ever touched. If he fails, he is nothing. If he dares refuse, he is less than nothing." Laughter rose, cruel and bright, filling the hall like a storm of knives. All eyes turned to the father. His daughter clutched his hand tighter, trembling. His breath came shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. He did not understand the symbols. He had never studied their laws. He had never been invited into their schools. And yet, something stirred. The stone called to him, not with words, but with echoes buried deep in memory. He remembered nights under the stars, telling his daughter stories of Earth, stories his own father had told him, of patterns in the sky, of shapes in constellations, of knowledge not taught in alien palaces but carried in human blood. He stepped forward. Gasps rippled through the nobles. Some jeered, certain he would collapse in shame. The minister's smile widened, anticipating humiliation. The father placed his hand upon the stone. The surface rippled, light surging outward like water disturbed by touch. The alien symbols shimmered, rearranging, twisting into forms the court had never seen. He traced them not with knowledge but with instinct. A circle here, a line there, as though he had always known where they belonged. Whispers rose into cries. The stone pulsed brighter. Then, with a sudden shudder, it awakened. The spirals aligned into a single blazing star, light spilling across the chamber, casting the nobles into shadow. The puzzle, unsolved for centuries, stood open beneath the touch of a forgotten man. The hall erupted. Some shouted in disbelief. Some fell to their knees. The princess's eyes gleamed, reflecting the star now burning within the stone. And the minister, his face twisted, the confident smile cracking into fury. The father withdrew his hand slowly, uncertain, bewildered by what had happened. His daughter's small eyes shone with pride, though she said nothing. He did not raise his head. He did not claim victory. He stood in silence, as though afraid even now that it could be taken from him. But silence was no longer his cloak. The hall could not unsee what it had witnessed. A shadow had touched the untouchable. A man dismissed as nothing had done what the blood of empires could not. And though the court reeled, though the minister seethed, though disbelief tore through the ranks of nobles like fire through dry grass, one truth had been lit. The invisible had become undeniable. Yet this was only the beginning, for what is revealed once can always be tested again. And the minister, humiliated before all, would not allow the shadow to stand. The hall had not yet recovered. Even as the glow of the awakened stone dimmed, its light seemed to linger in the eyes of those who had seen it. Whispers surged like waves against the walls, nobles clutching at their robes, generals muttering beneath their breath, priests pressing trembling fingers to ancient symbols. It was impossible, unthinkable, and yet it had happened. A shadow had solved the unsolvable. The princess stood motionless, her gaze fixed upon the man. Her eyes did not waver, though the faintest spark glimmered in their depths. Curiosity, sharp and dangerous. She had seen something no one else dared to acknowledge, and she was not about to look away. But the minister, he burned. His pride, his authority, his very foundation had been pierced before the entire court. His smile had vanished, replaced by a storm of fury barely contained behind clenched teeth. He stepped forward, voice rising like thunder. "This proves nothing," he roared, and the echo rattled the crystal pillars. "The stone is ancient, weakened. A shadow's fumbling may have disturbed it by chance, but chance is not destiny. We do not bend the laws of our empire to accidents." The crowd nodded eagerly, desperate to cling to denial. Relief bloomed in their faces, for it was easier to believe in failure than to accept revolution. The minister spread his arms wide, his robes unfurling like wings. "If this shadow dares to stand in the light, then let him face truth. Let him prove himself not with tricks of stone, but with knowledge no human should possess." At his command, attendants dragged forth a great tome, an archive bound in skin of unknown origin, its cover etched with silver veins that pulsed faintly with life. It was the Codex of Lineage, a record of law, prophecy, and history written in the empire's most ancient tongue, a language so old that even nobles feared to mispronounce its words. The minister's eyes glittered with malice. "Let the shadow read." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The Codex was sacred. To touch it without worth was blasphemy. To fail was to prove eternal inferiority. The father froze, heart hammering, his throat dry. He had never seen such symbols, never studied such lore. His daughter clung to him, fear wide in her eyes. He wished to refuse, to step back into the darkness where he belonged. But the hall was watching. Thousands of eyes bore down on him. And the princess still pointed, still waited. The tome was opened before him, pages unfurled like wings of a dying star, each inscribed with runes that shimmered faintly, as though alive. The minister sneered, certain of the outcome. The father leaned closer. At first, the markings swam before his vision, senseless and alien. But then something stirred. Shapes became patterns. Patterns became echoes. He saw in them not foreign words, but fragments of memory, whispers of stories his people once told. Tales of fire, of sky, of covenant. Symbols that mirrored constellations he had traced for his daughter in the dirt of forgotten streets. His lips moved, hesitant, broken. A single word fell, harsh and imperfect. The court hissed in scorn, but then another followed, and another, each one clearer, stronger, as if the tongue that should have been alien was already buried in his blood. The hall shuddered with disbelief. The nobles leaned forward, robes rustling like waves. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. Priests gasped, their prayers faltering as the shadow read aloud the words none but their kind had mastered. The codex glowed faintly, its runes igniting as though welcoming recognition. The air thickened, pulsing with energy that had slumbered for centuries. The minister's face drained of color. The father's voice rose, not with authority, not with pride, but with quiet steadiness. He spoke the ancient passage to its end, the final word echoing like thunder across the chamber. Silence followed, heavy, absolute. The tome closed itself with a resonant crack. The glow faded, the hall trembled, and then came the uproar. Some cried that it was impossible. Some claimed trickery. Others whispered of prophecy, of covenant, of bloodlines forgotten. Fear and awe mingled until the air itself seemed ready to break. The princess's lips curved, just slightly. Not a smile of joy, but of recognition. She had not erred. She had seen what others could not. The minister staggered back, his fury twisted into panic. Twice he had sought to destroy the man. Twice he had failed. The father lowered his head again, silent, humble, bewildered. He had no understanding of what he had done, only the weight of every eye upon him, only the fear of what would come next. But one truth could not be undone. The invisible had spoken the language of kings. And now, the empire itself began to tremble. The codex had fallen silent, its glow retreating like a tide drawn back into the depths. But silence was no longer peace. It was thunder held in the chest of the empire, waiting to break. The father stood frozen, his breath shallow, his eyes lowered, too afraid to meet the gazes that burned into him. Around him, the nobles whispered frantically, their voices colliding like storms. Some hissed accusations of trickery, others muttered words of prophecy they had sworn were only myths. Generals clenched their fists, uncertain whether to defend tradition or surrender to truth. Priests pressed their foreheads to the ground, trembling before something greater than doctrine. And then, on the pages of the codex, light flickered once more. It was faint at first, a shimmer like a candle fighting the dark, but it grew stronger, brighter, until symbols rose from the parchment itself, spinning in the air like stars torn from the night. They swirled, forming constellations the court had never seen. The father raised his eyes at last, and in their glow he recognized them. Not alien constellations, human constellations. Gasps tore through the chamber. The patterns blazed above their heads. The hunter, the crown, the river, shapes passed down through human tongues for generations, never recorded in alien lore. They hung there now, undeniable, carved into the air itself by the codex of lineage. The priests cried out, "It cannot be. Those stars are not of us. They are of the forgotten covenant." The hall shook with uproar. For the first time, nobles faltered in their certainty, eyes darting between one another, faces pale beneath their jeweled crowns. The minister stumbled forward, his voice breaking with fury. "Lies, distortions. The codex has been corrupted." But his protest was drowned by the resonance of the symbols, their light growing until it illuminated every corner of the hall. In the glow, words formed, a proclamation hidden for centuries, its voice carried not by lips but by the very stone of the palace. "When the blood of the forgotten awakens the words of the ancients, the covenant shall rise. The shadows shall no longer serve, for they are heirs of the first promise." The words echoed like thunder, impossible to deny. The father's daughter clutched his arm, eyes wide with awe. The father himself trembled, unable to comprehend the weight now pressed upon him. He was no scholar, no noble, no warrior, and yet, the codex had declared his bloodline tied to something older, something sacred, something buried by the very empire that mocked him. The princess stepped forward. The hall parted like waves before her. Her gaze locked onto the father, her silver eyes now burning with certainty. She lifted her voice, calm but unyielding. "You have witnessed it," she said. "The covenant is alive. The shadow is no shadow at all, but a bearer of the first light." Her words shattered the last defenses of denial. Nobles fell silent, generals bowed their heads, priests wept. The minister alone remained standing, his face twisted with terror. His empire, his order, his very power, undone by a man he had called dust. The princess did not look at him. She did not need to. Her eyes never left the father, who stood trembling, still unwilling to believe that destiny had chosen him. But the hall had seen. The empire had heard. The legacy could not be buried again. And the minister, once cloaked in arrogance, now stood naked before the storm he could not contain. The hall, once trembling with revelation, now quivered with fear, for silence had fallen again. But this time it was not awe that weighed on the people. It was the dread of what the minister would do. His face twisted into a mask of fury, veins coiling at his temples. His jeweled robes rustled as he strode forward, voice like a blade cutting the stillness. "No parchment shall rule me. No prophecy shall unmake centuries of law. I am the voice of this empire, and I alone decide its fate." With a violent gesture, he tore the seal of command from his chest, a sigil that bound soldiers to his will. The guards who lined the chamber stiffened, torn between obedience and fear. His voice cracked like thunder. "Seize him, seize the impostor and his child. End this farce before it poisons the blood of the throne." The father clutched his daughter, heart pounding, breath stolen from his chest. The soldiers advanced, their armor gleaming under the strange light of the codex. The nobles leaned back in terror, unwilling to intervene. The priests hid their faces, but the princess did not move aside. She stepped between the soldiers and the trembling father, her cloak sweeping across the marble like a blade of silver. Her voice rang clear, cold, unyielding. "Stand down." The soldiers froze, torn between two commands, the minister's fury and the princess's authority. Silence stretched thin as a blade. The minister roared, "You dare defy me, child? You dare set yourself against the blood of order?" And then it happened. The codex, forgotten for a heartbeat in the chaos, flared alive once more. Its symbols burned brighter than ever, casting shadows that reached up the crystalline towers themselves. The air vibrated with a force older than the empire. Words carved themselves into the very stone, searing across the walls for all to see. "He who breaks the covenant breaks himself. Power born of deceit shall crumble before the rightful heir." The hall shook. Cracks split across the minister's sigil of command, shattering it in his palm. His soldiers staggered, their armor dimming as the invisible chains of his authority snapped apart. Gasps echoed through the court as the mighty minister stumbled back, stripped of the power he had claimed as eternal. He screamed, half rage, half despair, and lunged toward the father, his last act of defiance. But before his hand could strike, the light of the codex surged outward like a storm, caught him, lifted him, and hurled him to the marble floor. The nobles, who once bowed to him, now looked away. The priests, who had whispered his name in prayers, pressed their hands to their mouths in horror. The generals lowered their banners, their allegiance dissolving like mist. The princess turned, her eyes sweeping across the assembly. Her voice was steady, sharp as truth itself. "You have seen the covenant. You have heard the law. No longer shall shadows kneel before corruption. No longer shall bloodlines be silenced. This man is heir of the first promise, and by that truth, the empire itself must change." The hall erupted not in chaos, but in surrender. Some wept, some knelt, some simply bowed their heads, unable to deny the force that had overturned the world they thought unshakable. The father stood motionless, the weight of destiny pressing on his shoulders. He had not fought with sword or with fire, yet the greatest tyrant of the court now lay broken at his feet. The storm had passed, but the world would never be the same. The throne room lay in ruins of silence. The minister, once a mountain of authority, now crouched upon the cold marble, his robes torn, his crown shattered at his feet. No guards came to lift him. No priest dared whisper prayers for him. He was not destroyed, but worse, he was abandoned. The nobles who had mocked the poor father now avoided his gaze. Their jeweled masks of pride slipped, revealing fear and shame. Generals who had marched under the minister's banners lowered their spears, eyes cast downward, as though the weight of centuries pressed upon them. The very walls, etched with the codex's glowing words, seemed to accuse them of their silence, their cruelty, their blindness. The princess stood tall, her face calm though her heart beat like a storm beneath her chest. She did not lift the father's hand nor crown him a king. Instead, she let the truth itself linger, heavy in the hall, so that none could twist it into vanity. Her eyes swept across the trembling assembly, and her voice, soft yet unshakable, fell like judgment. "Let the covenant breathe again. Let no voice be silenced by power. Let every child of this empire know that truth cannot be buried." Her decree was not shouted. It did not need to be. In the stillness that followed, her words took root in the minds of all who heard them. Whispers carried them beyond the throne room, into corridors, streets, and villages where tales would grow. The minister groaned, clutching at his broken sigil. Once, his word could summon armies. Now, even his shadow would be mocked by children in the alleys. Humiliation was his prison, and he would walk in it for the rest of his life. Outside, the twin suns began to dip, spilling crimson light across the crystalline towers. For the first time in generations, the city's banners fluttered without the weight of false glory. Merchants spoke of reform. Scholars dusted forgotten books. Priests bowed lower, whispering prayers not to lords, but to truth itself. The father remained still, his daughter's hand tight in his own. He did not ask for reward, nor did he bask in triumph. He was simply a man who had lived unseen, and now carried the burden of being remembered. And as the court slowly emptied, the princess lingered, her gaze resting on him one final time. Her lips did not move, yet her silence spoke. The covenant is alive again. The empire had not yet changed, but its foundations had cracked. and in those cracks, something new was already taking root. The great hall emptied, its echoes fading into silence. What had begun as a trial ended as a prophecy reborn. But the man at the center of it all did not linger to claim thrones or treasures. He simply walked away. His daughter's small hand rested in his own, and together they passed through doors taller than mountains, into streets where common voices still trembled with disbelief. The banners above no longer seemed so high. The crystalline towers, once symbols of unreachable might, now looked fragile under the dying suns. Whispers followed him as he walked, some fearful, some reverent, some still doubtful, but none dared call him invisible again. He returned not to palaces but to the quiet path he had always known, to the modest dwelling where cracked walls sheltered his sleep, to the small fire where bread baked slowly, filling the air with warmth that no empire could provide. He sat with his daughter, brushing her hair from her eyes, his hands steady now, though his soul still trembled at the weight of what had been revealed. He had not asked for legacy. He had not sought to awaken forgotten laws. And yet, truth had chosen him. It had marked him not with a crown, but with memory. And memory, he knew, would ripple outward. Already, in the schools of the city, teachers spoke cautiously of the covenant. Already, children drew the constellations once thought lost, stars mapped by human hands long before alien empires rose. In market stalls, merchants repeated fragments of the princess's decree. In temples, priests whispered prayers that carried his name not as a ruler, but as a reminder that dignity lives even in shadows. The minister still walked among them, but no longer as a pillar. He moved hunched, scorned, his power crumbled to dust. His eyes darted at every corner, haunted not by swords but by the laughter of children, who mocked his fall as a story of warning. His downfall was not death, it was remembrance. The princess remained in her tower, gazing often at the horizon, where the light of 2 suns met the stars of 1,000 worlds. She spoke little of the father, but in the quiet of her chambers, she remembered his trembling hands, his bowed head, his refusal to claim glory. And in that silence, she knew the covenant was safe, for it had chosen humility over pride. And the father? He lived quietly, working with tools scarred by years of labor, raising his child in the shadow of towers that no longer seemed eternal. Yet every evening, when the sun sank low and the constellations appeared above, he would lift his daughter into his arms and point to the stars. There, he would whisper, though his voice shook, "That is ours, and no one can take it away again." Thus the covenant lived, not in courts or crowns, but in memory, in whispers, in children who learned that truth cannot be silenced. And long after towers crumbled and rulers turned to dust, the story of the forgotten father endured, like a star no shadow could ever cover.